You're listening to Shoe In, covering the ins and outs of all things footwear, from sneakers to heels, loafers to slippers, and every type of shoe in between. Brought to you by the FDRA, the Footwear Industries Association focused on retail, trade, politics, and fashion, helping create and enhance conversations on all things footwear.
Hey, welcome back to another edition of the Shoe In Show. We are so glad that you're here. I'm Matt Priest. I'm one of your shoe insiders. I have with me Thomas Crockett, the other. And Thomas, you and I have been navigating the landscape of social compliance from a regulatory perspective for quite some time, particularly with the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act that came into existence just back in June, not too long ago. And with that, it reminded me of just all the work that FDRA and our members have done in this space for decades now. And it's not perfect. As we talk through this episode, it's not a perfect approach. No one is perfect. But I do, in a confident way, think that our members are trying to do what's right. Our industry is trying to do what's right. And so because of that, it's always helpful to have folks come in from the outside, in particular, who have a critical eye on compliance and the factory audit system and supply chain visibility and all the things that go into building proper due diligence and informed compliance, terms that we will bat around today. And with that, I want to welcome in James McMichael, who has a long history, a proud history of working in the space, who is the fearless leader of Mosaic, and it's going to help us kind of unpack where we sit as an industry right now as it relates to compliance work, social audits, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, due diligence, informed compliance. It's all of it's a mouthful, but James is going to help guide us through it. So James, I want to welcome you to Shoe In Show, and really appreciate you coming on.
Thanks, guys. It's my pleasure to be here.
So it is 2022, James. You've been in Levelworks and Elevate, now Mosaic. You've been working. It's been your life's work, to say the least. Where, in just a few words, do you view kind of the landscape as it relates to compliance and social audits for apparel and footwear and textiles right now, relative to all the other past years that you've been doing this?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think in a really short answer to that is where we are in the middle of a full transition from a 30 years of voluntary action, activities, practices that have that started with the media and exposés, and then moved to investors and other stakeholders and consumers, and we are now moving into basically a full regulatory environment where and companies and the industry is not ready yet for that transition.
James, can you take a step back too and tell us what caused that big shift from 30 years ago to where we are today? Like what has accelerated that over the past year? And Matt mentioned the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. Is that the big driver?
Yeah, it's actually from a critical eye, you would actually look at the what's happened on the voluntary landscape, which has been a lot. I mean, you guys know, right? Just 30 years ago, 20 years ago, nowadays, that's status quo that any kind of company in footwear or any kind of consumer products, electronics, you name it, has some kind of supply chain program, a code of conduct. They're doing some auditing. Like that's changed and expanded hugely over the past 20 years or so. Despite that, though, the attention and the focus and the criticism of these type, sort of what they call top-down, compliance-driven programs has continued to grow and become louder. And there's been a lot of frustration by stakeholders that these programs are not really driving improvement. They're not getting the job done. And so while stakeholder pressure continues to mount, and even though brands have spent a lot more time and money and resources in these areas, they haven't actually from the critical eye, accomplished a whole lot. And so when you look at the regulatory environment, I see that as totally predictable and something we saw coming from a long way away. And essentially the government's kind of slowly getting on board that they agree.
Right.
They agree. And it could just be their constituents and their voters and their voter sentiments and the rest of the things that drive the political machine. But a lot of governments, right, agree with this, that whatever the voluntary system is that we have now is not good enough, and now they need to legislate.
Yeah, well, I mean, the other thing that kind of comes to mind as you were talking through that history, James, and dogs are always welcome, just so everyone knows. But when you think about what's happening in China in particular, and I think the U.S. State Department's only come out over the history of our country and pointed maybe 7 or 8 times to a genocide happening at the state level, right? The national level, the Holocaust being probably the most infamous of them all. When the State Department came out and said, "Hey, look, the Chinese government is going after the Uyghur population in a systematic way," that's like the next level. And so, if you think about like a systemic response to that, is going to have to be some federal legislation, right? It's not going to be the brands kind of doing their voluntary work around this space. So I think that also changed it when you had the U.S. government pointing to this, and then the response being a bipartisan, almost passing with no vote. I mean, almost moving very easily through Congress. I think that also changed the dynamic as it relates to what's happening specific to China, pushing us more into this regulatory environment. Am I incorrect in thinking about it?
There's 2 things happening in parallel, right? There's this Uyghur situation, which, as you said, is a kind of an anomaly in some way. It's something's happening. It's become highly political. It's been taken up by both administrations, and so this is a unique circumstance, but that has just coincidentally been happening in the context of these human rights due diligence laws slowly making their way through the legislative sausage maker around the world, it's somewhat coincidental. I think the big difference when people right now, or companies or brands, are looking at all these laws that are being passed in Germany, and they're going to coming through with EU, and they're popping up all over the place, is that that CBP has always had laws on the books around forced labor and child labor. They could always detain product. They could always stop goods at the thing, and they've started to do that. They don't actually even need this law to continue to do what they've been doing, right? And so what's that game changer, what's really unique about what's happening now, as you guys know, is that, it's one thing to pass a law. It's another thing to then enforce the law. And then it's another thing to enforce the law with rigor. And we don't know what these other laws are going to look like in terms of enforcement down the road. So that the urgency that this has sort of, brought out is just heightened everything. And it sort of seems like it's feeding on itself. It's other countries are looking at what we're doing with the Uyghur Protection Act. They're looking at different things that are similar. They're looking at enforcement, like everything's sort of now just sort of moving up quickly.
Yeah, it seems too that the approach before was, more targeted. You're looking at least in the U.S., you're looking at specific products, cotton, tomatoes, certain producers, and now you're hitting every product from this part of China or connected to it. It could be other parts of China. And, how do you, what's your thought on how, as a company, you kind of handle this massive shift there? And also on the tracing and mapping, you have to, now it's, it's even stated in the enforcement strategy, a lot of talk about, you need to map your entire supply chain. You need to trace your entire supply chain. You have to know where every single material comes from. How do companies handle this?
This is the fascinating part about this to some degree, is that the industry and service providers that serve the industry are not ready for this. The technology is not there. The capacity to do these things is not there yet. Even if you look at even the things that there is capacity to do, like social auditing, even that is hugely criticized. even by customs itself, for lack of independence, lack of professionalism, integrity, bribery, you name it. And so you look at all aspects, all the buckets that these due diligence and what customs is wanting from brands now, all the buckets are kind of really immature at different levels. And so if you're a company starting from scratch, it's, incredibly daunting. It's not like you can look to one brand and go like, they're doing it totally right, because nobody is. And that's the kind of the fascinating thing, is that these laws, there's a great piece that we can share that was done, that kind of compared the difference between what a typical social compliance brand program looks like. Mm-hmm. That's what most people do basically, right? Which is a top-down, screen suppliers, audit them, send them a corrective action plan. They send it back. They do it or they don't, and you kind of keep moving. It's part of the buying process. The difference between that and what is now being called a mandatory due diligence system. It is a system. Mm-hmm. And that system starts from here, as you said, Tom, with the traceability and really understanding. And then it's using that information you have and trying to really profile from a risk standpoint where problems arise. So, and then it's really evaluating what's going on to the extent you can in an independent manner. And then the piece that we've been crying about for years is, how do you actually drive improvement? Right. You're spending 90% of your money on monitoring, auditing, risk assessing, and reporting, and 10% of it on actually improving. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that that's a model that doesn't drive, results. So that's a huge part. And that's the part that we're working on in Mosaic, is how do we scale the improvement part? Mm-hmm. And then last is this total evolution of reporting expectations. You have ESG reporting, you've got investor reporting, you have sustainability reports, you have all these rating agencies, and now you've thrown all these laws on top that are, so, all areas of this whole system need to be re-looked at, reconfigured, reconnected, and it's going to be a really big transformation of the entire industry. Is what we're seeing.
Yeah, for sure. So before we get to the Mosaic aspect of this, James, which is a super cool system, and I can't wait to talk about it, I do want to kind of step back for a moment and play a little devil's advocate, because I found, this isn't specific to you and your viewpoint, but just in a general sense, the system itself, the whole thing is kind of weird to me in the sense that next, there's on the show Portlandia, there's this bit where Fred Armisen and his co-host or his co-star are at a restaurant. They're asking if the chicken they're about to be served is grass-fed and this and that. Yeah. And the next scenes are like they're accosting the farmer on the farm before they even bite into the food to figure out where this is all coming from. And truth is becoming stranger than fiction, because that's essentially what we're now being pushed to do collectively as an industry. And I've always just thought, how weird is it to go into a business? If I was to go into McDonald's and say, hey, before I order a number one with supersize, I'm going to go and check your time cards and your pay stubs to ensure that you're paying your people appropriately and that you're abiding by U.S. labor law. And that you'd be like, that's ridiculous. And that's essentially what we've built this infrastructure to do over the last few decades. And so part of me is just cynical that there's no way to do this to effectively enough to meet the demands of the regulatory
I think that's absolutely
right. I just think it's like a fool's errand.
It's crazy. I mean, I remember going into new industries and new companies, a big fast food chain, was the same thing. They tried to do what apparel companies were doing, auditing their factories. They started auditing butchers and farms and cannery all over the U.S. And doing that was just like what you just said, going into American businesses that meat packing and saying we're from so and so fast food restaurant. We want to start digging into everything, talk to your workers. And they were like, this is madness. Mm-hmm. No way. Mm-hmm. You're ridiculous. No, we'll have our attorney here and just kind of like smash through this like total invasive process in a supplier, and it is totally awkward and weird.
Well, and lay on top of that cultural and language barriers, and it's a recipe for not a disaster. That's too hyperbolic, but it's a recipe for not accomplishing what you think you can accomplish in this structure. Now, let me argue out of the other side of my mouth, though, because of the highlight of these issues, I think by Western companies are talking points, and that's not a disingenuous term. Just because we call it a talking point doesn't mean it's not true. But what we've often said is that, you know what, if it wasn't for Western companies with their values coming into these countries and developing business relationships long term and establishing, pushing the Chinese government, for example, to change their labor laws and helping factories better treat their workers better and more appropriately, then that would not have happened, right? Our influence would not be there. So it's important that we're there. Is there truth to that from your perspective?
I think that it's both true. Both of those things are true. It is perverse and weird from a relationship standpoint on your suppliers, but it is also true, right?
Right.
For what we've done in on tier one, the message is out there that certain types of activities, child labor, things like that, are not acceptable, and they can be fixed, and they can be identified, and they can be improved. So I think that there is a strong argument that these programs, generally speaking, have had a positive impact on what it is, what it could have been, right? Or where we don't know, right? But we can assume. I think where another transition we're at, though, that kind of brings us all together, Matt, is that from a international labor organization standpoint, from a local government standpoint, they like our own government has an agenda. They have a theory of change and of enforcement. They have their own legal structure. They have the courts. They have everything that they have as a country, right, to manage the business behavior within their borders. And and what brands have done is they've created an entirely commercial version of enforcing local laws and their own standards that sit above them on their own. And they don't work in connection with local institutions and the long-term theory and structure of improving conditions in a country is the country. And that's something that's become very a frustrating point with the ILO Better Work program and the ILO hierarchy when they look at brands as partners. But the brands are partners, but they also look at them as adversaries. They look at them as somebody that's skirting the normal channels within a country, rustling feathers, disrespecting local institutions for their own to cover their own ass. And that's how they see these top-down voluntary programs. They see them as totally self-serving, and therefore the intentions of what these programs are different to the brand than they are to a local institution or government, and they're different to the factory, and they're different to the workers. Everybody's having a different intention, and when you have so many different competing intentions, everybody's unhappy. Nobody's happy with what's going on. And that's a fascinating, dynamic of this.
It seems like, an added challenge is you're dealing with kind of a one-size-fits-all framework for a number of different industries. And we look at, just look at apparel versus footwear and just how much complexity there is in the footwear supply chain. And, how many you take, the number of inputs that goes into a shoe, and you can be dealing with, a bill of materials with, 40, 50 to 60, 70 different inputs from all these different sources and trying to manage that. So interested in your thoughts on that. And also, where does Mosaic come in? How do you guys help manage this really complex area that we're talking about today?
Yeah, it is a complex, nuanced topics. I think that the thing that we've observed over the years is that things that have worked, things that have driven improvement and actually worked, not a big shocker, are ideas, concepts, activities, actions that are hyper localized to the nuances of that specific place, right? Whether that's language, it's culture, it's the nuances of that business, that factory, what they're working through, their turnover issues, their quality issues, whatever, like hyper localized programmatic things, right? And I think what these top-down cookie cutter programs are highly non-localized. They're highly cookie cutter. They're highly outsourced to third-party testing and inspection companies to implement. And so when you step back and analyze what actually works, if you really want to drive improvement, we need to de-cookie cutter these activities. And so with Mosaic, that is our goal essentially, is to find a scalable way to like infuse what are cookie cutter programs and hyper localize them so that the brand has a better understanding of what's actually happening in that country, in that place. And also that the factory has a much better understanding of their own laws, what they need to do to actually understand and meet what the brand's asking for. So it's this localization of these activities that we believe is a foundational, almost like a computer. You got Intel inside, or powered by Pentium. All these programs with all their auditing and people and this is and codes, and if we can infuse that with real content that's meaningful for that each individual country in a scalable way, that sets the foundation for the right dialogue. It sets the foundation for meaningful discourse between brands and their suppliers around what's realistic, what's real, and hopefully reduces friction with regards to improving.
Yeah, I mean, having gotten a test run from you, James, on the system, I was highly impressed. And one of the things I think that stood out to me is the fact that it is so difficult to stay on top of the many iterations of changes that happen to local labor law and other types of laws that are of interest to our members. And I've seen big corporations struggle with it, right? Just not having the resources that they can assign to track these things. How have you built a system that allows you to keep an eye and do the due diligence that the brands need to help enhance their own due diligence? That's a heavy lift, but you guys have seen.
Yeah, I mean, it's really just looking at these programs and going, what do they actually share rather than what's different about them? Mm-hmm. And they all share as a foundation the laws. They're saying you need to follow the laws of all the countries. And those laws usually are 80-90% of what we're actually asking of these factories. And those laws are not in conflict with local institutions. They're not in conflict with the long-term vehicle of change in those countries. And so, rather than everybody out there doing a half-assed job with the laws and curating them and auditing against them, it just seemed like really, really logical that, one place we can do the legwork together and share this content. And we can also suck out from local context those people that know that topic well, that technical content, and share that with the masses. There's another company on the product side called Compliance and Risk that I sort of look to as sort of like as inspiration, where they've done that on the product regs. Mm-hmm. Like we stop outsourcing all of the knowledge around laws to testing and inspection companies, right? And allow the democratization of what the content really should be in a curated way around these topics, and allow that to be the platform where we share. So it's really just like, it's really not that big of a lift. It's just has to be done. It has to be done in a credible way.
Right.
The bar is extremely low out there, actually. So that also, makes it a little easier. But there's so much that we can share that doesn't even get into the whole, this brand has this standard and this brand has that standard and their report is this and they use this audit firm. Like, that's all fine. That can live over there, wherever the hell that's living. But we can all be drawing from the same pool of like quality information, including the factories,
Is there anything, just one more thought too, on all this things we talked about with compliance and the Labor Force Labor Prevention Act? I know there's a lot of things that companies need to do to get ready and to think about all this, but is there something maybe people are not thinking about, or just one tip or one takeaway that you would share to companies as they think through this?
I think I would my advice to them would be to look at what they're currently doing, not in a really like micro iterative manner. To look at the discourse right now is focusing on their programs and just customs and stakeholders saying this sucks, this doesn't work, and to really try to engage this idea of what a due diligence system really looks like, right, from a systematic standpoint, and to kind of go back to the drawing board and really open yourself up to really what the purpose of these laws are, what they're trying to achieve, and not just try to do another kind of audit or some other, I think that is because Customs has already said they looked at these social audit programs and that are being submitted and they're like, they suck. we don't find value in them. And by the way, your stakeholders don't find value in them, and the activists don't find value in them, and the factories don't find value in them, and the workers don't find value in them either. So what are you really getting out of them? Monitoring and auditing is always going to play an important role. There's no question about it. So it's not like throw it all out, but I just think that companies, chief compliance officers, general counsels need to, they're going to have to, wrap their head around that this is a whole new, landscape that's going to have to be created here.
Yeah, that's for sure. Well, we appreciate, James, your expertise and your wisdom helping us navigate this new landscape. It's not going away. And so if folks want to get more information about Mosaic and about what you guys are doing in this space, what's the best way for them to connect with you?
Yeah, they can just go to our website. It's easiest, Mosaic RSR. That stands for Responsible Supplier Resource. So mosaicrsr.com. And then there's emails, and obviously on LinkedIn we can be found as well. You can get in touch with me or our staff, or and same with your factories in country. It was great to come on. I hope to come on again. This topic's going to keep coming. I have some other guests I want to sort of introduce you guys to that could also take this down different types of rabbit holes on this topic that I think would be helpful for your listeners too. So we'll connect after on that.
Awesome. Well, we appreciate you coming on. Folks, it's been another edition of Shoe and Show. We've got 330 plus episodes in the bank. We really appreciate you listening. Our audience is growing. And now that we've been doing this over 6 years, to continue to build an audience and to have issues to talk about, like the ones that James, Thomas, and I spoke about today, is just a blessing for all of us to stay connected with this industry. You guys are doing great work, and we want to be a part of that. And so reach out to us. For FDRA members, you know how to get a hold of us, info@fdra.org. If you're interested in membership, you can hit up the same email and we'll send you information. But at a minimum, go to shoeandshow.com and download all prior episodes. Most of them are still relevant to this day. We've talked from everything from social compliance to marketplace trends to new technologies, 3D printing. We've had a lot of fun episodes along the way. And so our entire catalog is at shoeandshow.com. Please rate us and share us with friends, family, and coworkers. And I'm sure they will be glad that you did. And until next time, on behalf of Thomas, James, and myself, Shoe and Show is out.
Shoe In has been brought to you by the FDRA, the Footwear Industries Association focused on retail, trade, politics, and fashion, helping create and enhance conversations on all things footwear. For information about FDRA, visit fdra.org.